Welcome now to part 3 of our study of Pontius Pilate and the Jews. We left off on page 83 where Nicodemus was filling in Pontius Pilate as to the various conspiracies against Jesus and the role of the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin in planning his demise. So, let me just read the last paragraph here to fill you in. And this is what Pontius Pilate has to say about the intelligence report received from Nicodemus. Quote, "I was at first not a little surprised that such a mountain should be made of a molehill, and told Nicodemus so. But listening to Nicodemus, I soon realized that the Jewish hierarchy were out on a serious charge against the man, namely Jesus. It was, I then felt, one of those cases which the priesthood would have gladly taken before the emperor himself." So Pontius Pilate realized that the Sanhedrin wanted him to execute Jesus, or at least allow them to execute him. Otherwise, they would take their complaint to Tiberius Caesar, stage an uprising, and that would be the end of the funding from Judea. So let's pick it up now. "The case was handled by Caiaphas by reason of his being the high priest. But everyone knew that the real head of the priesthood was Annas, without whom nothing of moment was done in the affairs of the theocracy. Annas, head of the great Sadducean family, was notorious for his harsh judgments. He had been appointed high priest by Quirinius in the year 7, but had been deprived of the dignity 7 years later by Valerius Gratus, although his 5 sons had been successfully pontiffs. Annas was a master of intrigue. When Quirinius, after the census, had degraded the high priest Joazar, who had proved quite useful to the authorities and incurred the displeasure of the Judeans, Annas was chosen as the one among the temple aristocracy least displeasing either to the Romans or to the Judeans. And indeed he had managed to maintain his influence with the procurators through difficult times. During the absence of the governor, he had stretched his powers to the extent of carrying out capital sentences, and we had removed him from office." Okay, this verifies the complaint we found in a previous study, namely in Josephus, that the Sadducees and Pharisees and the Sanhedrin were not allowed to put a man to death without Roman permission. But when the Romans were absent, they would do this anyway. And so here's an instance of Annas doing exactly that, while hoping that the Romans would not catch on. But they did. So they removed him from office. But though Annas gave a formal consent, he merely transferred the chair of the Great Council to the younger member of his family, his son-in-law Caiaphas, who nominally and ostensibly was the high priest, but actually a puppet in the hands of a powerful family, at the head of which stood Annas. The priestly hierarchy consisted of the high priest, his deputy or sagan, 2 suffragans of the sagan, 7 priests or keepers of the temple keys, and 3 treasurers or keepers of the sacred vessels. But when one looked into the relationship of all these hierarchies, one found out that they were related by family to one another. They were men of infinite pride, all wearing the mitre, and some of them conspicuous for their oriental luxury of their dress. Yeah, these were either Babylonian Jews or Edomite Jews for the most part. And I'd say the difference between the Pharisees versus the Sadducees is the Pharisees were local hooligans vying for power, and the Sadducees were primarily Hellenizers from the days of the Maccabees. So let's continue. Nicodemus told me that Annas had chosen to follow the normal routine and have the prisoner tried by the Jewish court in the usual way, so as to be able to pass it on to me on the higher political charge. The man, Jesus, he said, was arrested by the officer of the guard in the small stone-walled Garden of Olives, close by the path to Bethany, in the shadow of the temple hill known by the name of the oil press Gethsemane. The man, Jesus, had obviously gone there to rest after a troublesome day. It seems that he and his 12 disciples had previously supped together. The police did not need the help of the informer to identify their prisoner. As they approached, Jesus went out of the garden enclosure to meet them, asking, "Whom do you seek?" To their surprise, he told them he was Jesus and asked them to let the other men, his disciples, go their way. He was led away without any attempt at opposition. What passed when he was taken to the mansion of Annas, or what hints Annas had sent to Caiaphas, Nicodemus could not say. Possibly Annas passed on the prisoner to the legal high priest at once, and without more ado, especially as the Sanhedrin was in session in the mansion of Caiaphas. The house, like most of the better houses in Palestine, had a closed porch giving access to an inner court enclosed from the street by walls. The soldiers borrowed from Antonia had halted outside, for their presence in the court would have been a defilement. The Judean guards and the temple-serving men went in with the prisoner. This Sanhedrin is not a legal court in the sense of a Roman tribunal. It is only a traditional committee of public safety, which we have allowed to exist and continue to function for the sake of peace. But the ecclesiastical hierarchy are masters of form. I had often heard it said that the Sanhedrin was to save, not to destroy life. No one could be tried in absence, and no one was left undefended. The votes of the youngest members were taken first, lest they might be influenced by their seniors. In capital charges, a majority of at least 2 was required to condemn, and while a verdict of acquittal could be given at once, a sentence could be pronounced only the next day. Hence, capital trials could not begin on the day preceding a Sabbath or a public feast, nor could a criminal trial be continued through the night. Nicodemus was most concerned about what he described to me in confidence as a flagrant violation of all propriety. Only witnesses for the prosecution had appeared, eagerly brought forward by the judge. Not one single witness for the defense was called for. In a word, the court sought from the first to condemn. There was, Nicodemus said, no definite charge against the man Jesus for which the law provided a sentence. The ancient law, which was everlastingly invoked by the priestly caste, had not anticipated the case of anyone calling himself the Messiah. The charge of having broken the laws of the Sabbath was not punishable by death. The trial, he said, had been a sheer mockery. Caiaphas had fired question after question. Why did the prisoner gather so many followers? What did he mean by sending them through all the land of Judea, announcing the coming of the kingdom of God? Why, a few days before, at his entrance into the city, had the prisoner allowed the crowds to hail him as the Messiah? Why did he not formally proclaim himself the Messiah? The man had replied, "Why do you ask me? Ask some of the multitude who have heard me. The law requires that witnesses should first be examined in any trial," unquote. At this, one of the attendants struck the prisoner on the mouth, demanding, quote, "Answer you, the high priest, thus boldly?" The man had answered calmly, "If I have spoken falsely, prove that I have done so. But if what I say be right, why do you strike me?" It was a fundamental rule of Judean jurisprudence that condemnation could only follow the concurrent testimony of at least 2 witnesses, and of course this is Mosaic. But some who came forward had nothing relevant to say. Others contradicted themselves. Caiaphas had then turned his invectives against the priestly body. But no suitable witnesses were to be found, especially as the words of Jesus about the tribute money were badly understood by the populace. Meanwhile, the man stood silent, even to the charges so hateful to Jewish ears as contempt for the temple or his boast that he would rebuild another temple in 3 days, he made no answer. And his composure was both calm and lofty, said Nicodemus. But of course, when Yeshua said, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days, he was talking about his own body, referring to his own resurrection. Caiaphas then stood up from his couch. Is this silence a confession of guilt? So all of a sudden, it's now lawful to condemn yourself by silence. And suddenly, speaking in Aramaic, the common speech of the Judean courts and of the nation, he had put this question, quote, I put you on your oath by the living God and require you to tell us whether you are the Mishpucka, the King Messiah, the Son of God. You see, said Nicodemus, this was a question that would compromise the prisoner at once with both Judeans and Romans. To proclaim himself a king would be a crime of lèse-majesté. Caiaphas is very cunning. But the man, referring to Jesus, he said, had calmly replied, quote, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask questions that would prove my highest claim, you would not answer. You have said the truth. I am the King Messiah, the Son of God, and the Son of Man, unquote. At this, all the judges had risen from their cushions and demanded in loud voices, Are you then the Son of God? The man replied, You have said it, and I am, unquote. They had gained their end. All voted that further investigation was purposeless, that on his own confession the man Jesus was worthy of death. Now this account is somewhat different from the gospel account. Of course, this is what Pontius Pilate heard. Okay, let's continue. They had gained their end. All voted that further investigation was purposeless, that on his own confession, or what they construed to be a confession, the man Jesus was worthy of death. Quote, and you voted too? I asked Nicodemus. He spread out his hands as if to say, What could I do? Quite so. Nicodemus could not face the social proscription and ridicule which would follow his abstention or his voting against the others. He said, quote, The prisoner has now been left in charge of the temple police, unquote. And with that, and with what sounded to me as a touch of sadness, he added, and they are a rough lot. The real point, Nicodemus said after a while, was that the hierarchy felt that the man was diffusing a spiritual influence which might develop and spread and undermine the theocracy. Policy, Caiaphas had been urging at many settings, that the Sanhedrin had held in those days, demanded that the man be at once put to death. That's policy, not law. Sound familiar? The sentence, and to man be put to death to prevent his overthrowing the whole ecclesiastical constitution. The sentence had been decided before Caiaphas took his seat for the trial. Quote, He has been sentenced unjustly, said Nicodemus, almost with a sigh. I looked at him with questioning eyes. He knew he could trust me, for we had often discussed many strange points of their law and the unhappy relations between the Judean people and the Roman authorities. He bowed his head, and for a brief moment he covered his face with his hands. Then he said, Sir, I have come to believe that this man is Jesus, is a just man, and I am not brave enough to avow it, but he is a just man, and perhaps he is the Son of God. Then, after a pause, he added, quote, Now the judges have retired for an hour's sleep. Before daybreak the heads will extemporize some high court of the nation, for the precedents require that the whole Sanhedrin should meet to ratify the sentence of death. Then they will hand him over to you to put him to death, unquote. And then Pilate says, But why all this bitter hatred for the poor man? Nicodemus answered, It is no longer a religious matter. It is political persecution. for the priestly caste, the man Jesus is no longer a Judean, and they treat him as they would treat any man of another race. The man Jesus was led before me when it was still early, not yet 7 o'clock. This is quite normal in those parts, for the heat requires rest during the hours that are the busiest with us in Rome. The Sanhedrin came en posse, led by Caiaphas himself, crossing the lofty bridge which ran from the west hall of the temple to my residence, over the Tyropaion and across the open space of the Xystus, with its pillared porches. Some of the members of the Sanhedrin came to conduct the case for the prosecution, others to offer evidence. The case was heard in the open courtyard of the palace, as was customary, and my curule chair, beautifully encrusted with ivory and very comfortable, was set down on the tessellated floor of the tribunal in the outer court, and I was attended as usual by the assessors, who were Roman citizens, acting as members of the judicial bench. I asked the customary question what constituted the formal opening of the trial. Quote, "What accusation bring you against this man?" The trial then proceeded in the ordinary way, for the Sanhedrin could not expect me to pronounce a sentence on their findings without looking into the nature of the accusation. They knew me sufficiently to know that I was not really ready to accept their opinion and decisions. Besides, I had formed beforehand the impression that the man Jesus was guilty solely of some ecclesiastical offense, and I did not wish the priests to bring matters of that kind before me, nor to use me for their own ends. They laid their charge. It was on the lines explained to me by Nicodemus the night before, and it was certainly involved. The first clause of the charge related to the native religion, and I was not interested in the matter. Consequently, I proceeded immediately to that portion of the case which appeared political, and so I asked the prisoner whether he was guilty or not. Quote, "Are you king of the Judeans?" Unquote. The question was absolutely necessary, but he did not give me a direct reply, turning his answer into a question instead. Quote, "Are you asking this yourself, or did others tell you about me?" Unquote. It was clear that he himself was genuinely asking for information in order to give an adequate answer. That is to say, he meant, quote, "Are you asking me this as a Roman? And will you interpret an affirmative answer in the sense in which a Roman would normally understand the term king? Or did Jews talk with you? And does your question mean that you wish to ascertain whether I am the Messiah in a Judean sense?" Understanding his intention, I said, quote, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done?" My question was put strictly in the Roman sense. I did not intend to inquire into the particular beliefs of the Judeans or the names used by them. All I wanted was to ascertain whether this man Jesus had committed any act which would place him under the scope and terms of the Julian law of treason. But in reply to my last question, the man made a statement he did not affirm or deny. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not far from hence." Unquote. I wondered, and I confess I hesitated. The man was definitely transposing the accusation from the political to the supernatural world. I asked him again, "Are you a king then?" He replied, "You say that I am a king." I felt pity for the fellow. The whole trial was beginning to look absurd, and the religious aspect of the accusation was becoming more and more patent. I looked at him. He was a man of medium size. His complexion was fairer than that of those around him, less bronzed, and the type of his features was hardly Jewish, but rather as if the Greek types were blended. He stooped a little, but although his movement there was not the affectation shown by so many rabbis, he had dignity and grace. The only strange thing about him was his hair. It was bright auburn and somewhat bleached by the sun, and he wore it very long. He was dressed in a red tunic which reached his wrists and feet, and over this a colored talith with the prescribed tassels of blue and white at the four corners. I looked at him, and I thought he was cutting rather a pathetic figure, and I felt that I would have liked to release him. I asked him how he intended to prove his title of king, and he replied, quote, "To this end have I been born, and to this end I came unto the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth." Unquote. I asked him, "What is the truth?" He made no answer. I then turned to the prosecution and said, quote, "I find no fault in him." At this stage, the trial began to degenerate into noisy proceedings. The crowd that filled the public space became a mob. It was evident that many of them were there for the purpose of creating a disturbance in case of an acquittal. Someone shouted that they expected of me the punishment of Jesus. They clamored that I had heard the man confess that he was a king, and the confession certainly rendered him subject to the law of treason, for it diminished the authority of the government of Rome. At this, a wave of annoyance swept over me. I had heard of the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on the preceding Sunday, but I felt convinced that the movement of his followers was a mistaken one, and surely this tame, bland man could have no intention of fomenting a rebellion against the empire. He was technically guilty, perhaps, but innocent of any intentional guilt, and I wished that the prosecution would not press the charge. But the pressure, and I was sure it had been prearranged, passed from the prosecutors to the mob. Yeah, the Jewish hire mob, as we have in our modern day today. The Jews can hire all kinds of people to create a disturbance, such as Black Lives Matter, crisis actors, and BLM. Further accusations were made, and I said to Jesus, "Behold, how many things they accuse you of. Are you answering nothing?" But Jesus answered nothing more, and I wondered. I must add that no sooner had I taken my seat on the tribunal than a message was brought to me from my wife, Procula. She is a good wife, but a strange woman, much inclined to having dreams, which she claims are full of prophetic meaning. The message she sent claims are full of prophetic meaning. The message she sent was to entreat me not to condemn the man, for, she said, he was a just man. I confess that after reading her message, I felt a sort of superstitious fear. What if the man Jesus was one of the heroes or the demigods of our mythology? I rose from my chair and I took him into the palace, and there I inquired into his descent and claims. But the man made no reply whatever. When I reminded him of my absolute power over him, he made the mournful remark, quote, "You could have no power at all against me except if it were given you from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto you has the greater sin," by which he meant that the Jews, via Caiaphas, Annas, the Sanhedrin, and all of these Edomites that had taken over Judea, had the greater sin in his death than the Romans, clearly stating that the Jews are guilty of his death, not the Romans. What did he mean? I ordered him to be led again to the court, and once more I heard the witnesses. Some again gave evidence against him on various topics. Others testified that he had done much good without breaking the law, meaning their Jewish law. And here I have to interject, since it was the Edomite Antipater and his son Herod that provoked the Romans into attacking Judah and therefore usurping the kingdom of Judah, it was the Jews who had the greater sin. But it was teamwork between the two. Continuing, but voices from the crowd kept saying, quote, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout Judea, from Galilee even unto Jerusalem." Hearing this, I asked, "Is this man a Galilean?" I saw in this a chance of getting out of my difficulty. If the man was from Galilee, would be a graceful courtesy to send him to be tried as a Galilean before his own prince. And Herod Antipas was in residence at the old palace of the Asmoneans, not far from my official residence. So I ordered Jesus to be led under escort to Herod, and the accusers had no choice but to follow. But in less than 1 hour the man was brought back to me, wrapped in a white robe, the Jewish royal color. Once more I summoned the accusers. I had found nothing in the charges that was worthy of death. I endeavored, therefore, to save the face of the Sanhedrin by giving a verdict of guilty coupled with a desire for leniency. The Julian law of treason admitted only of acquittal or sentence of death. I did not consider the prisoner guilty of treason. But to fall with the pressure of the Sanhedrin and their mob, I was prepared to find Jesus guilty of some lesser offense and order him to be scourged and released. Now it happened that I also had to hear the case of another man named Barabbas, charged with some disturbances in the city and with murder. It was customary on the feast of the Passover to release one prisoner. I seized the opportunity and asked the populace in the court to choose whether Jesus or Barabbas should be released. The offerer was juridically a possible one because whilst the Roman law did not admit that a prisoner could be pardoned after he had been convicted, Jesus had not yet been convicted of treason, and Barabbas' case had not yet come before me, and I only knew of his name from the charge sheet. But at once it became clear that the priests were passing the word that the crowd should ask for the release of Barabbas and the crucifixion of Jesus. If some thought differently, their voices were drowned in the din of those who clamored against him. Yeah, the Jews hired a mob to take control of the situation. So they chose Barabbas to be released. I asked, "What then shall I do with him whom you call the King of the Judeans?" The reply came with a shout, "Crucify him!" Once more I asked, "What harm has this man Jesus done?" I did not even ask what crime, for in my view he was truly enough guilty of offense against the law of treason. But his offense was so light, so unintentional, that I would prefer to pronounce the verdict of not guilty. But the priests and their mob appeared immovable, and I knew the opposition I had at all times in my dealings with them, at every step of my official duties. I knew only too well that should I exasperate the Sanhedrin by depriving them of their vengeance upon this unfortunate self-proclaimed prophet, their vengeance upon me would be relentless and pitiless. A voice arose from the crowd, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend." It was quite clear. The Sanhedrin would bring against me in Rome an accusation of having refused to punish a man guilty of treason against the state and the empire. I am but a man, and few men I know could be described as heroic, and certainly none in the civil service. Bureaucrats they be. I had now no alternative but to pass sentence. And yet, at that moment, the idea came to my mind of demonstrating my feelings to the people by a dramatic act. I asked for water, and washed my hands before the multitude, and I said, quote, "I am innocent of the blood of this righteous man. See you to it." I knew the superstitious nature of the Judeans, their love of the spectacular, and I hoped it would touch their conscience like a ritual. Little hope there. The same voice from the crowd shouted, quote, "Let his blood be upon us and our children." And still I hesitated. I delivered Jesus to the soldiers of the guard, who scourged him, crowned him mockingly with thorns, put an old purple garment on him, and brought him out again. "Behold the man," I said. But the Judeans again cried for his crucifixion. I said, quote, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I can find no fault in him," unquote. The centurion Petronius, who attended the execution of the sentence, gave me afterwards some strange details. The condemned man was too weak for the beams which were to be erected crosswise, and which he was supposed to carry on his shoulders to the place of execution. The streets were hilly, and soon his strength was exhausted, and his slow advance delayed the procession. The guards grew impatient and ordered a passer-by to help in carrying the beams. The fellow was a foreign Judahite from Cyrene, in the province of Libya, where a vast number of Judahites had been settled for some 300 years, carried there by Ptolemaeus Legae. The execution took place at a spot that the Aramaic parlance the Judeans called Golgotha, which means a skull. I had heard the centurion call it Calvaria. It was a spot near some of the suburban gardens, and it was thus called because it was bare and smooth and domed like a bald head. The beams were set up in the usual way, that is, the short one nailed crosswise upon the longer one, what we call crux emissa. It is, I know, a terrible form of execution. The condemned man is laid on it as the cross rests on the ground, his two arms stretched along the two crossbeams, and his body resting on a projecting pin of rough wood, misnamed the seat. The Egyptians only tie their victims to the beams, but we hold them firmly by driving a big nail through the palm of each hand into the wood. The legs are then bent up until the soles of the feet lie almost flat on the upright beam, and then they too are fastened, either separately or over each other, by two or one great nail. The condemned man, who the centurion said in his report appeared in a state of extreme weakness, was given, as usual, a draught of the wine that the soldiers carry with them, a sour drink of unpalatable local wine that the soldiers call pasca. But he told me some of the ladies of Jerusalem, who had followed the procession, asked permission to pour into the vessel some bitter drugs, probably myrrh among them, which have a stupefying effect. The ladies of Jerusalem used to make it their special task to provide this soothing drink for all condemned persons. The board that had been mockingly borne before the condemned man was nailed on the upper part of the cross over his head. It reads, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Judeans. Written in the three languages of the country, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, so that everybody could read it. The noon heat was fierce, and the man soon showed signs of collapse, and I could quite believe it, for a physician has once explained to me that the suffering in crucifixion is most severe. The constrained position of the body and the outstretched arms cause acute pain from every twitch or movement of the back. Moreover, the wounds made by the nails in the hands and feet rapidly cause inflammation, and this spreads to the limbs, where the circulation is made difficult by the tension of the parts. The blood rises to the head, swelling the veins and arteries, and causing most agonizing tortures in the brain, while the heart grows more and more oppressed. Sometimes numbness and stiffness bring on convulsions, and it is not infrequent that death releases the sufferer only after 2 or 3 days of agony. But in a few hours this man was heard to speak. Twice he cried in Hebrew, Eloi, Eloi, my God, words that even the centurion could understand. Then he uttered a great cry, shouting, It is finished. His head fell, and he was dead. The centurion reported that the 4 soldiers of the quaternion, detailed to carry out the execution, had divided the clothes of the 3 condemned men among themselves, as they were their perquisites. The execution had been watched by a group of men, amongst whom were some of those who used to follow the condemned man about as disciples, and also by a few women, one of whom, it was said, was his mother. The centurion was surprised that the man had died so quickly, within 3 hours. He was inclined to believe that death had been caused by rupture of the heart, brought about by mental agony. Soon afterwards I was visited by Nicodemus, who was accompanied by a friend of his, a wealthy businessman from Arimathea, named Joseph. They came to submit to me that, as it was the eve of the great Passover Sabbath, it would not do to leave a corpse unburied, for it might be considered a defilement of the ceremonial purity of the holy city on that day. It was necessary, they said, that the man Jesus be buried without a moment's delay. At sunset, when the Sabbath began, was rapidly approaching. A deputation of the temple authorities had already waited on me to obtain my sanction for putting to death any of the 3 executed men who might yet be alive, and for taking down and burying the bodies, to which I had already consented. The soldiers usually hastened death when necessary by striking the victim a violent blow on the knees with a club, that the shock might kill the agonized man at once. I noticed that Nicodemus and his friend appeared to be deeply moved, and recalling Nicodemus's admission to me on the previous night, I readily agreed that the body of the man Jesus might be put at their disposal. I therefore sent for the centurion who had been in charge of the execution and gave him instructions to that effect. Nicodemus informed me, with his thanks, that he and his friend would bury the man in a tomb in a garden not far from the Calvary, which Nicodemus said Joseph had hewn out for himself in the hillside. Caiaphas, however, must quickly have heard of this and taken alarm, for a deputation from the temple immediately called on me to express their apprehension. The dead man, they said, had spoken of rising from the dead on the 3rd day, and it might happen that his disciples might steal the body so as to deceive the people. It was therefore necessary that the grave should be watched. You have a guard, I answered them. Go and make it as sure as you can. By now I was truly tired of the whole disgusting business. The strangest of all strange stories got about on the Saturday morning, that the dead man Jesus had been resurrected, and that he had totally disappeared. I have always felt inclined to think that the body was stolen. Yet I remember that the sentries were quite convinced that the gods had intervened. They said to their centurion, who reported it to me, that they had placed to and fro all night on their beat before the sepulchre, against the opening of which a great stone had been rolled, and a strong rope passed across it, the edges being sealed with clay. And all night they had kept vigil, their fires lighted, for the spring night was chilly, so that anyone approaching would have been disclosed at once. But in the morning, they said, an invisible force had rolled back the stone from the door, and as it opened, the dead man had come forth and had vanished. Soon afterwards, when the soldiers were still dazed, the same women who had watched the crucifixion had arrived, and finding the tomb empty, had rushed to the city and spread the news. Before I left Jerusalem to return to Caesarea, I held a long conversation with Nicodemus about the events which I have related. For I must confess that, perhaps under the pressure of my wife's grievances, or was it because I had been thoroughly disturbed by a trial which went against the grain, or because an impression of the supernatural seemed to have followed the execution, a cloud of doubt was floating across my mind. Had the trial been unfair? Had the man Jesus been unjustly condemned? I remember that I found Nicodemus most eager to go over the ground with me. I was indeed astonished to find him ready to discuss and disclose to me such details of the Sanhedrin's trial as left no one in 2 minds as regard to what Nicodemus himself thought of the whole matter. As regards the trial I had conducted, Nicodemus agreed that it had followed the normal procedure. In the provinces of the empire, the business of the law courts is conducted in a very special manner. The law is administered in what we call the clearly outlined administration of Egypt. At the head of the provincial government of Egypt stands the prefect, who is appointed personally by the emperor, for Egypt is one of the provinces which the emperor always keeps closely under his personal control, preventing the Senate from exercising any influence. The governor of Egypt is usually a knight, receiving the title of prefect of Egypt. During the reign of Augustus, Egypt was divided into 3 judicial districts. The prefect visits the chief city of each district once a year to hold law courts and to inspect the administrative work of the local officers. To assist the prefect in this work, there are 3 extra-judicial, one for each judicial district, and as far as I know, until this time they have always been directly appointed by the emperor and chosen among the knights, which indicates that the imperial government feels the strongest necessity for keeping criminal jurisdiction in the hands of Rome itself. Next to these officials are the strategii, or presidents, of the smaller districts. When the prefect goes on circuit to one of the three divisions, he is accompanied by the epistrategus of that division, while the strategii of the smaller divisions are in attendance. The whole legal business can be transacted expeditiously because there's a most systematic administration. In the first place, the cases are all prepared in advance and the documents ready for inspection by the prefect. Secondly, matters of minor importance are left to be disposed of by local officials who also have police powers. Thirdly, the prefect can, at his direct discretion, delegate cases to the epistrategi, the juridicus, and other members of the legal department after the prefect himself has examined the documents. The prefect only reserves for his own attention those cases that seem to him of greater consequence, or those that have a more direct bearing upon the welfare of the administration in the province. This method of administering the law is more or less the same in all provinces. The governor goes periodically on regular circuits, and this makes it necessary to work with a certain expediency. That is, trials and lawsuits are not conducted in the slow and complicated manner in which they are conducted in Rome. The governor hears one case after another as they are presented to him upon his arrival in the town where he is holding court. And as many governors are military men, they have no time for legal niceties. But what I want to make clear is that it is wrong to believe that the procurators have no legal jurisdiction of any kind unless they receive some form of delegation from a superior officer, and that in my particular case, I, as procurator of Judea, should have received delegation from the proconsular governor of Syria. The most elementary study of our provincial administration shows that the designation procurator was used in two different meanings. At the time of Augustus and in the early days of his successor, the empire was still being organized and new sections were constantly being added. Some of these sections were territorially small, but for various reasons it did not appear advisable to incorporate them in already existing provinces. So they were given their own governors, whose position was exalted in the fine title of legatus Augusti, more commonly called procurators, although in the case of larger provinces, the same name is used to designate the financial agents of the governors. Judea was one of the small sections of the empire which had been allotted to an independent procurator. My functions and powers were therefore similar to those of the governor in the larger and more self-contained provinces. My highest power was the jus gladii, or power of life and death. This right was conferred upon the first procurator of Judea, Pontius, and his successors suffered no diminution of authority. In the case of the prosecution of Jesus, the local officials in Judea were the high priests and the Sanhedrin, who arrested with their police power any alleged breaker of the law. They next had the duty to cause witnesses to appear before the Judean court and to tell their story in order that the Sanhedrin might ascertain the evidence. It was necessary that the evidence thus collected be of some significance if it was to command the attention of the procurator. In this respect, the legal status and functions of the Sanhedrin correspond to those of the strategist of a divisional district of Egypt. The strategist is appointed by the prefect from the native race. The Sanhedrin, a body already existent, is sanctioned by the empire, but has been given new and more limited functions. We had found an ancient system of local tribunals in Judea, and allowed them to maintain a partial activity, although reducing their function in criminal cases to that of preparing the documents and sifting through the evidence, so that the suits might be more expeditiously handled by the procurator. The reason why this ancient system of courts was allowed to remain is conjectural, but the fact remains is that the Judean courts are still allowed to treat ecclesiastical cases because we decided that it would be least irritating and disturbing to racial feelings to allow the native courts to continue a part of their former jurisdiction. The Sanhedrin has therefore a definite subordination to the Roman court. I will make it clear in this way. Our Roman law does not possess an officer whose duties are those of a crown prosecuting counsel in the service of the state. The courts take no notice of a crime until some citizen formally presents a charge against the alleged criminal. That is to say, instituting a criminal prosecution is dependent almost wholly upon private initiative, and the state very rarely undertakes a prosecution on its own motion. Such was the case of the trials of Catalina or Dolabella for conspiracy against the state, which were instituted on charges brought on the initiative of private citizens. Moreover, in Rome we have a separate court for the hearing of each kind of crime. If a charge of political treason is going to be instituted, a citizen must appear at the office of the praetor in charge of the court of treason and lodge a definite complaint. The praetor will then investigate in order to discover whether the complainant can furnish the sufficient evidence to justify him in holding a formal trial. And if the magistrate feels that the evidence is sufficient, he will accept the accusation and appoint a time for the hearing. Thus, the complainant becomes the public prosecutor and is expected to conduct the case and guarantee the presence of witnesses. The governor of a province corresponds to the presiding praetor of a criminal court in Rome. But the difference lies in the manner in which the initial stages of the criminal suit are handled. In the provinces, it becomes necessary that the preliminaries of a case be entrusted to persons appointed for that purpose, and such is the position and office of the Sanhedrin. In the case of the man Jesus, the Sanhedrin, having arrested Jesus, proceeded to investigate his public life and activities with a view to presenting charges against him before the procurator. Then the Sanhedrin, or their representative, lodged a complaint before the procurator and became the plaintiffs in the Roman court. We agreed, Nicodemus and I, that the Sanhedrin's particular grudge against the man Jesus was a religious or ecclesiastical one, but they knew only too well that such a charge would not be regarded by the Roman court as a punishable offense. And as they wanted to be rid of Jesus by putting him to death, they had of necessity to shift the evidence in such a way as to substantiate a charge of treason, which alone could merit capital punishment. The reasons for their grudge against the man were manifold. This Nicodemus and I knew only too well. In particular, there had been a speech by the man to his followers, which contained points that were perplexing enough both from the ecclesiastical and the hierarchical point of view of such a peculiar society as the Judeans. The man Jesus had claimed for himself the right to forgive sin, a thing that for the priestly caste was in itself a blasphemy of the first magnitude. He had abandoned the observance of the Sabbath, and this was, well, at least in part, it was only healing on the Sabbath, and this was a distinct violation of the law of Moses. He had shown a deliberate preference for the company of sinners and publicans who were shunned by the Judeans. And moreover, he was teaching to the multitudes doctrines which would undermine the entire authority of the priests and bring their undisputed wisdom into discredit. Nicodemus told me that on that very evening the man was arrested. The priests had met again at the palace of Caiaphas. Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, scribes, and elders, all sinking their differences in their determination to put an end to this trouble. The meeting, Nicodemus said, reached two conclusions: that the man Jesus must be put to death at any cost, and that it must be done with an appearance of justice, lest the multitude of his followers be incited to anger. Some even suggested that at the meeting that it might be wiser to postpone the arrest for a week, that is, until after the celebrations of the Passover, to give time for the multitude of pilgrims to disperse. But before they parted, Nicodemus said, a message reached them to the effect that one of the 12 disciples of the man Jesus was ready to assist them in trapping him. The message was brought by one of the captains of the temple. These were members of the Levitical guard that had the care of the sacred buildings. The man, the captain said, was waiting outside and was ready to act as a guide for a small reward. Nicodemus left me in no doubt that in his view the trial of the Sanhedrin that followed was not in accordance with the Mosaic Code. The 4 rules of the Mishnah, or older portion of the law, that is the starting point of Jewish jurisprudence, he said, are strictness in the accusation, publicity in the discussion, full freedom granted to the accused, and assurance against all errors of testimony. Now these are obviously part of the Mosaic law of the Judahites. The Jews, even today, do not honor these rules and regulations. This code was interpreted by the Judean courts for their own guidance and is fully explained in the treatise on the criminal law in the Talmud. There was, said Nicodemus, scarcely a single episode in the proceedings against Jesus that could be made to harmonize with the rules of criminal procedure, which must be followed to the smallest detail, according to the explicit commands of the Talmud, and of course, according to the Mosaic law. I will summarize the exposition made to me by Nicodemus in this conversation, and of course, the elders and Pharisees would add to whatever law there was by Moses. Even before the actual trial began, certain important irregularities were committed. The Sanhedrin had held meetings at 3 different times to discuss the advisability of taking action against Jesus. At the first meeting, held 2 days before the Passover, the intermediate decree of excommunication, called execration, was passed against the followers of Jesus, and there was a discussion upon the desirability of enacting the extreme form of excommunication against Jesus, namely, death. At the second meeting, this vote was actually passed, and the death of Jesus was decided upon. At the third meeting, on the night of the arrest, the Sanhedrin no longer discussed an appropriate sentence for Jesus, but merely planned the proper time and occasion for executing their previous decision. As I have already said, they were uncertain whether or not they should postpone carrying their plans into effect until after the feast. Now the decisions reached by the Sanhedrin were irregular because the Talmud lays down the rule that the witnesses shall be the accusers, and the Sanhedrin shall act as a jury. Yet, contrary to this principle of justice, the Sanhedrin had reached a decision to condemn before the actual trial began. What has always puzzled me is that if the priests designed to kill Jesus, they did not get rid of him in the Garden of Gethsemane instead of going to all the trouble of arresting and trying him. Did they fear a popular tumult? If so, the secret murder of Jesus in the garden would have been a much less potent stimulus to hostility than the patent illegalities which occurred at the trial. The priests, Nicodemus said, gave Jesus what can be regarded as 3 trials. One before Annas, one before Caiaphas, and the third before the full Sanhedrin. The one before Annas was in the prejudicum. The last one before the Sanhedrin was the ratification of the sentence by Caiaphas. Jesus was firstly taken to the house of Annas. Nicodemus could not find a real explanation for such a step, as Annas held no official position except that he had much influence. Annas, Nicodemus had subsequently heard, had limited himself to questioning Jesus at some length about his teaching and his disciples. And this was not in itself illegal, for Annas was not judging but apparently only seeking information. From the house of Annas, Jesus was taken to the house of Caiaphas, who was the high priest and as such was president of the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas represented, too, the great Sadducean element. The Sadducees, as rationalists, had no particular enmity of Jesus, except their general distaste for the introduction of the divine element in human affairs. But they were the aristocratic and official party, and as such they were most keenly alive to the disorganization which is often caused by mixing things human and divine, and were therefore more than anxious to suppress it before it got to a dangerous stage. The Pharisees were also a large part of the council, and their patriotic and religious feelings had been scathingly treated by Jesus. When a trial occurred on a capital charge, the Sanhedrin, according to the procedure fixed in by the Talmud, was expected to hear all the evidence at one session. If the court then voted for conviction, an adjournment must be taken until the following day, when the court would again assemble and vote again upon the question of conviction or acquittal. Moreover, in holding the trial late at night, the Sanhedrin was guilty of extreme irregularity, for the Talmud said that the capital trials are commenced only in the daytime and concluded during the day if there was a verdict of acquittal, but must be postponed to a second day if there is to be a condemnation. The hearing of the case against Jesus occurred on the day before the Passover, which, as I have already explained, was definitely forbidden. It happened also that this was the day before the Sabbath. I can only record here Nicodemus' assurance that the complex Mosaic code absolutely forbade the holding of a court on the day and at the hour when the case of Jesus was heard by the Sanhedrin, and nothing that occurred at that session was in harmony with the procedure required at a criminal trial. The session was held at the house of the high priest. It should be held in open court, of course, whereas the Talmud said that the Sanhedrin may lawfully pronounce the sentence of death only in the hall of the hewn stones. One very interesting point emerges from the fact that when the time came for Jesus to present his own case, he made no attempt to defend himself or to summon witnesses on his own behalf. The point in law was that if the prisoner did not dare to defend himself, the trial was finished, because two witnesses had given evidence that Jesus had uttered a threat against the temple, thus satisfying the requirements of the law of Moses for a sentence of death. That the man did not intend to defend himself was clear when he was brought before me, when he uttered no word, and I marveled greatly. The high priest Nicodemus said, obtaining no response from the accused, came directly to the vital point by asking Jesus whether or not he was the Son of God. Quote, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Unquote. At this, Jesus at last made an answer, and it was in the affirmative. You say it. Witnesses had just given evidence that Jesus laid claim to a power which no human being could possess, and Jesus did not deny nor attempt to disprove this charge. Caiaphas, therefore, had sufficient convincing evidence before him. I was told that Caiaphas asked Jesus to recant with the customary Jewish formula, quote, I adjure you by the living God. But even with this solemn warning, Jesus did not deny, but rather affirmed the accusation. Caiaphas then had turned to the Sanhedrin, quote, You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? Unquote. And the Sanhedrin had unanimously voted that Jesus was guilty of a capital offense by claiming to be the Son of God. From that moment, the duty of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus explained to me, should have been to investigate the truth or falsity of such a fantastic allegation. In a Roman court, this would have sounded laughable, but the Judeans had a long experience of prophets true and false, and their jurisprudence expressly recognized the necessity of investigation in cases of prosecution for false prophecy, although it was, he told me, quite a long time since anyone had put forward such a fantastic claim. It was at this stage that the grossest irregularity was committed by Caiaphas, when he turned to the members of the Sanhedrin and announced that Jesus had spoken blasphemous words. Blasphemy is not mere profanity. It is profanity which, as the name imparts, strikes directly against God. This crimam majestatis divinae was the greatest and most dangerous liberty interpreted as being treason against Rome, treason against the earthly rulers. And by so doing, Caiaphas was declaring openly his own opinion, whilst the procedure most definitely prescribed that the high priest should ask the youngest member of the court to be the first to express his opinion, after which the voting should proceed gradually towards the oldest and most reserved members of the Sanhedrin. Yet, and Nicodemus was most emphatic about it, they could not condemn him to death, for the Mosaic law condemns no one to death upon his own confession. Accordingly, they only found him worthy of death. After Jesus was thus pronounced guilty, the session adjourned to assemble again at dawn. This would clear the Sanhedrin from the irregularity of not having held two sessions for a capital trial, but for the fact that the Hebrew day began with sunset and continued until the following sunset, with the result that the two sessions were actually held on the same Judean day. This rendered the decision of the Sanhedrin invalid. These were the faults Nicodemus found with the Sanhedrin's handling of the case. But when in the morning the man was brought before me on a charge of treason, I had no alternative but to try him and sentence him. The law on the subject of treason throughout the empire still is the one proposed by Augustus and known as the Julian law of treason. It says, quote, "The accusation of treason is made on the ground that the act done is inimical to the welfare of the Roman people, or is contrary to their safety. The Julian law of treason declares that he shall be held guilty who has done injury to the name of the Roman people. He shall be held guilty by whose acts friends of the Roman people shall become enemies, or who shall maliciously bring it to pass that the king of a foreign nation shall be less obedient to the Romans. The private citizen shall be held guilty who willfully and maliciously assumes the functions of an official," unquote. Now I will set out this quite clearly. I was the procurator Caesarius. That is, I was the deputy, the attorney of Tiberius in that province. I was no mere procurator fiscalis, with the function equivalent to those of the questor. In other words, he's not just a money collector. I was a procurator cum potestate, a governor with civil, criminal, and military jurisdiction, directly responsible to my great master in Rome. The relation of the emperor himself to the world is that the emperor stands, neither more nor less, as the representative of Rome. To us Romans, even in these times of ours, the name of king is intolerable, and absolutism is distasteful. Because of this, we cloak our present absolutism under republican forms. Indeed, we saw Augustus, when he became the undisputed chief of the republic, and determined so to continue, nevertheless remain, at least nominally, a private citizen. The savior of society dared not attack the constitution of the state. He effected his object in another way. He gathered into his own hands the powers and functions which the state had for centuries distributed among its great magistrates and representatives. He became perpetual princeps senatus, or leader of the legislative house. He became perpetual pontifex maximus, or chief of the state church. He became perpetual tribune, or guardian of the people, with his person thereby made sacred and inviolable. He became a perpetual consul, or supreme magistrate over the whole Roman world, with the control of its revenues, the disposal of its armies, and the execution of its laws. And lastly, he became perpetual imperator, or military chief, to whom every legionary throughout the world took the sacramentum, and whose sword swept the globe from Gibraltar to the Indus and the Baltic. And yet, in theory, the emperor is a simple citizen, a mere magistrate of the republic, and I, the Roman knight who governed in Judea, was his representative in my public capacity. Tiberius, so to speak, was the proconsul or governor of Judea under the nominally existing Republic of Rome, and I was strictly the procurator of the great proconsul, holding civil and military authority by delegation from him. And it was my duty to see that no person of my province should violate or attempt to violate the Julian law of treason against the safety and the integrity of the Roman people. It is therefore absolutely clear that I, as a Roman magistrate, was bound to step in when a charge of treason was made, or a charge of seditious movement, or any offense which aimed to infringe the power of Rome. Jesus had confessed to regarding himself as the Son of God. This the Sanhedrin had interpreted as treason against the Roman Empire. The Sanhedrin held that the confession was equivalent to a claim that he was the Messiah, and the Messiah was to be a temporal king. It had happened not long before that false messiahs had led the people of Judea into abortive revolutions. For this reason, a new leader who called himself the Son of God, who taught among the common people, who applied to himself the messianic prophecies of the past, and was gradually winning favor in the nation, offered the Sanhedrin a ready opportunity to present him to the Roman court as a suspicious individual who might provoke dangerous revolts. For, according to the Judean nation, and even Mosaic tradition, a Messiah was to combine the functions of both spiritual and temporal leader. That the Sanhedrin had every interest in deferring as long as possible the advent of a Messiah is beside the point. Influential Jews might think that Jesus fulfilled their expectations of a spiritual leader, but they could not believe that he could satisfy the national ideal of a temporal king. Yet they knew that the people had been led astray before. The same thing might happen again. The reports about Jesus were alarming, and certainly they spoke of him as a king, whether spiritual or temporal I am not myself not clear. I did not know until it was too late that the Sanhedrin's conclusions had been far from judicially impartial. They had convicted him of treason, and I had no choice. The actual form of the charge brought before me was this, quote, "We found this man perverting our nation and forbidding tribute to Caesar by saying that he himself is Christ the King," unquote. The first part of the charge had, it is true, a distinct reference to the ecclesiastical charge of false prophecy. But the second part was a definite charge of treason based upon the Julian law. It was this second charge into which I inquired more particularly, for I would neither understand the nature of the heresy nor be interested in it. On the charge of treason, I told the representative of the Sanhedrin, "It is not the way of the Romans to deliver any man to death until he who is accused has the accusers face to face and has license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him." They answered, quote, "If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him to you," unquote. Therefore, just take our word for it. The proceedings, as I have already said, degenerated into violent scenes. The mob tried to influence the court. They implicitly threatened me with impeachment before the emperor unless I acceded to the wishes of my subjects as represented by the Sanhedrin. They were determined to ask me to sanction a verdict already decided by them. My trial of the man was, in my own court, a perfectly regular trial, nor was the man tried by me for the second time for the same offense, which would have been impossible under Roman criminal law. But the Sanhedrin knew only too well that I had had my experience of their underhand methods of incriminating a governor before the emperor. Could I risk it again, and in a matter of treason? I am, if I may say so in all frankness, a man of my class, a worldly-minded civil servant. Our own needs rank certainly higher than the needs of others. Yet I was not unmoved by feelings of justice and mercy. My conduct to the Jews was severe, but not cruel or tyrannical, and I can say that it was no easy matter to deal with a people so arrogant and perverse. I knew that day that the priests were acting under deliberate malice and were instigating the populace in an effort to terrify me. I had to choose between my personal safety and that of an obscure Jew, and anyway, the injustice was done to him not by me, but by the Sanhedrin, who were his own people. Or so he thought. I remember quite well that Nicodemus and I discoursed long into the night about the injustice of that trial, and I was much moved by the emotion with which Nicodemus recalled the strange disappearance of the man's body from his grave and the supernatural aura that seemed to be attached to the events. Still, what was done, and nothing could be remedied. When I returned to Caesarea, considering how strange news had a way of traveling faster than couriers, and knowing only too well how Rome thrived on all such gossip from the more distant provinces, I thought it advisable to send a detailed report to the emperor. So I drafted with my own hand a report to Tiberius, although of course all such reports would go to the colonial office, and there be sifted on a presses made out of them, and passed to the various departments. That only a summary of it would be shown to the emperor, and only when it might be considered to be such as to supply the palace with a new topic of conversation, as this one would not fail to do. About the man Jesus, I heard no more, neither in Jerusalem nor in Rome. End of document. Thus ends this outstanding book entitled Pontius Pilate and the Jews, originally edited from the Autobiography of G. Pontius Pilate by C.M. Now, by way of epilogue, I would like to try to explain as briefly as possible how the outside world perceived these Judeans. We have to remember there's two distinct types of Judeans living in Judea from approximately 125 BC until the destruction of the temple and the scattering of just about everybody who lived there, with a few exceptions. The Christians actually left first. Those Christians were exclusively from the tribe of Judah, because no Edomite would ever convert to Christianity. But the outside world did not perceive this difference in the culture and had no interest in it. All they knew was that there are some people coming from this area called Judea, and that neither group was welcome by the other people into their countries. But the reasons for this dislike was completely different in the two cases. So let's start with the Judahites first. Because of all of the infighting during the Maccabean Wars between the patriotic Judahites, and we're talking about the Maccabean Wars, we're not talking about Jews who are not Israelites or Judahites in any way, shape, or form. We are talking about the full-blooded Judahites descended from the patriarch Judah and their Davidic dynasty that survived all the way down to the time of Jesus Christ. Although the last reigning qualified, legitimate king of Judah was executed by Herod a few years before Jesus came on the scene. So Herod the Edomite actually put an end to the Judahite line of succession of the Davidic dynasty in Palestine. It had actually been transposed into Europe many centuries before, and that's another subject. But we have to understand that because of all of this infighting and civil war among the Judahites of the Maccabean period, first they were invaded by the Greeks, and the Greeks tried to impose their will upon these Judahites, tried to change their religion. The local Judahites rebelled, fought against them, and actually threw them out under the Maccabees. But nevertheless, during this period of time, there were traitors to Judah who made common cause with the Greeks. And because of the fighting against the Greeks, and because there was two factions of Judahites, those who were pro-Greek and those who were pro-Mosaic, the infighting between these two groups was very fierce. It was actually a civil war in addition to fighting a war against the Greeks. So you have to understand, this is the situation just before the Romans entered the scene. So the best way of conceiving the Sadducees is that the Sadducees were pro-Greek, not necessarily traitors to the country, but pro-Greek. They did a lot of business with the Greeks. That's how they became prosperous, and that's how they managed to become members of the Sanhedrin. So, are they law-abiding Judahites? I would say no, because they were doing too much business with the enemy. Okay, so that takes care of the Sadducees. The Pharisees also started out in this area, but as a more populist group of Judahites who, because of their popularity with the people over time, not necessarily during the Maccabean Wars, I think they were just standing in the shadows waiting to see who would win out, the Greeks or the Judahites. While this war was going on, these Pharisees positioned themselves with the people as men of authority, actually teaching things that were not in the Mosaic law, and thus gaining a foothold for what's later called the Talmud, the traditions of men. And this is exactly what Jesus Christ accused these men of. Up to the time of Herod, these Pharisees were actually Judahites who were basically using their control of religion to manipulate the people for their own benefit. So you had the Sadducees manipulating the people. They were already very rich and didn't really need to manipulate the people to get money out of them. But the Pharisees were doing just that, manipulating the people to get the donations, the money sent into the temple, etc., etc. The entire Sanhedrin was in control of how these funds were distributed, the masses of funds coming in from all over the Judeo-Christian, well, at this point, the Judahite world outside of Judea. There was no Christianity just yet. So, the outside world perceived only one group of Judeans. They did not perceive the difference between these Judahites who had left Judea just to escape the wars, the Maccabean Wars, and the subsequent Judeans who were placed over Judah by the Romans. These were essentially Herodians. They were Edomites. They were not of pure Judahite blood. What happened after Antipater, the father of Herod, had bribed Julius Caesar a great sum of money and other Roman officials to place his son Herod in the position of governor of Galilee. This was the beginning of the partnership between the Edomites and the Romans, by which both Rome and the Edomites profited. So the Edomites were the middlemen, the tax collectors, the controllers of the people, etc., while the Romans were the occupying force. As Herod gained more and more power thanks to the Roman army, he went about executing all of the pure-blooded Judahite Sanhedrin. Josephus clearly tells us that he executed the entire Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin may have contained one or two Pharisees, but after this, the Pharisees became more loyal to Herod because they began to fear him. So now the country was taken over. The Greeks are out of the picture. Now the Sanhedrin is a purely Roman Edomite affair with some holdovers from the Sadducees and some Pharisees possibly being Judahites as well. But from the record provided here by Pontius Pilate, the only Judahites that he could prove were actually full-blooded Judahites were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, and maybe one or two others. But when Herod had slain the entire Sanhedrin and got rid of the pure-blooded Judahites, then he began to fill the position of the Sanhedrin with his cronies, many of whom were simply Edomites, many of whom were traitorous Pharisees, and others being traitorous Sadducees. The Essenes were a group that left Jerusalem because of all this discord. They could see no future for the Mosaic law in these circumstances, and they just got up and left and went out into the countryside and formed the Essene monasteries, is the best way of putting it. They were monasteries. So that's the situation that obtained in Judea at that time. Now, with regard to how these two groups of people were perceived by the outside world, first of all, you had pure-blooded Judahites migrating out of Judea Actually, even before the Maccabean period, there were waves of migration coming out of Judea, out of Judah, in the Middle East, to Rome, to Greece, to France, to Britain, to Troy, Ireland, Spain, etc. These people were primarily of the house of Judah, either Zerah Judah or Pharisee Judah, the two sons of Judah. They both had royal ambitions, put it that way. The Romans were in fact descended from Zerah Judah. They had left Egypt before the Exodus. They under Zerah Judah, they sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, founded Troy, founded Rome, founded portions of France, the Peloponnesus, Spain, Ireland, Britain. They founded all those nations. They were all founded by Judah. And Paul understood this, that the Romans were in fact descendants of Zerah Judah, when he said, and I'll just quote his words from Romans chapter 11, verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive, he's talking to the Roman Judahites here, and thou being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. The olive tree here symbolizes Israel, and true Judah, and no other people. In verse 18, he says, and remember, he says, broken off. If some of the branches be broken off. He's not talking about grafting a non-Israelite branch onto an Israel branch, like the churches falsely teach. He's talking about people who are in fact Judahites, whose branches were broken off the original tree. This happened in Egypt. And now he's confronting them. He's talking to them now in Rome, where he finds them. And there are also Judahites from Pharisee Judah who had departed to Rome because of the Maccabean Wars. They simply got tired of all the fighting and moved to Rome, where they were actually welcome. However, not by the local people, however, they were welcomed by the regime, because wherever they wound up, that is, these Judahites, they were a very prosperous people due to the fact that they were very hardworking, talented, and innovative people who had a lot of wealth, gained a lot of wealth because of all of this talent, and because they were obeying Yahweh's laws. And part of that law was to stay separate from any non-Judahite people, non-Israelite people that they perceived as being non-Israelites. And for the most part, most of these Pharisee Judahites did not realize that they're actually dealing with their kinsmen of Zerah Judah in Rome. But of course, Rome had already become a pagan empire by this point in time, and there was no way that these paganized Zerah Judahites could get along with the Mosaic law-keeping Pharisee Judahites. So there was bad blood, and of course, since there were a lot of pagan elements in Rome from other parts of the world, not just from Zerah Judah, but other parts of the world, these Mosaic law-keeping Judahites were like a sore thumb in their midst, because they resented and actually envied the wealth and the favor they received from Rome, the Roman government. Why did they receive this favor from the Roman government? Because they became very prosperous, and they paid taxes to the Roman government, which the Roman government really appreciated, right? I mean, whoever pays the most money in taxes gets the better treatment, except today. If you're white and you pay a lot of taxes, you get murdered by the government. But in those days, Rome appreciated the presence of these hardworking, prosperous Judahites, even though they caused a lot of trouble and concern among the local people because of what they perceived as off-putting traditions. But these traditions are based on the Mosaic Law, which tell us, Israelites, we are not supposed to mix with the heathen. We are simply not supposed to mix with the heathen. And therefore we are to remain separate from them. And that's just what these Judahites were doing. They had no choice but to leave all of the chaos going on in the land of Judah during the Maccabean Wars. And they had settled in places like Rome, Alexandria, Parthia, many places throughout Europe, France, etc., to just get away from all the fighting. So, nevertheless, they were resented by the other people around them. Now, contrast this with these Edomite Jews, which the outside world still perceived as Jews, right? They didn't perceive the difference between the true Judahites and the Edomites. Nevertheless, these Edomite Jews were also hated because of their money-lending activities. So, the Judahites were resented because of their prosperity and because of their off-putting separateness. But the Jews were separate in a completely different way. They were separated by the fact that they were an elite money-lending class, which weaseled their way into the government by using their wealth and power to manipulate the Roman government. They were not living in the midst of the Roman people like the Judahites were. They were simply resented for their money-lending activities and for their control of the Roman government through those same money-lending activities. This did not matter to the Roman people or to the people of any other country. All they knew was these people were Judeans, and whether Judahites or Edomites, their presence was not welcome. But you have to understand there's two different categories of Judeans throughout the world in this point in time, and they were both resented for these two different reasons. The money-lending activities were always by the Edomites because the Israelites were forbidden to get into money lending. They had never had a bank in the days of biblical times or even in the Maccabean period. They never had a bank. The bank and the money lending activities began when the Babylonians started coming into Judea at the invitation of the Edomites because they were actually brethren. And therefore, it was the moneylenders who Jesus drove out of the temple. These people were not Judah because it was a violation of Yahweh's law to go into the business of money lending. Yes, the Judahites would lend each other money, but were discouraged from extracting usury from each other. They were supposed to pay each other back in full without extracting usury. That is the Mosaic law. This proves once and for all that the Jews, who were always money-grubbing interest moneylenders, always violating Yahweh's law against usury, cannot possibly be the Judahites, but the Edomites under Herod, installed by Rome. So I'm hoping that this clarifies the situation, why the so-called Jews, whether they be Judahites or Edomites, were resented wherever they went for two completely different reasons. But most of the time, the people in that era did not know that there were two different breeds of Judean living at that time. And this is why Jesus says in John 19:11 that when Pilate asked him, well, who have you got a grudge against? Who's guilty here? And he said, the man who sent me to you bears the greater guilt. He was referring to Caiaphas, the Edomite Jew, the head of the Sanhedrin, and a non-Judahite. But Rome also bore part of the guilt because they're the ones who put these Edomites in power over the people of Judah. Nevertheless, Jesus says it was these Edomites who have the greater sin because they're the ones who instigated all this trouble against Judah in the first place by going to Rome and asking them to set Herod up as the governor over the people of Judah. I hope that is a satisfactory explanation of why there are two groups of Judeans, one the pure-blooded Judahites, the other the Edomite Jews who usurped the kingdom with the help of Rome. Thanks for listening. Praise Yahweh, pass the ammunition. See you again. Bye-bye.